A mindset is a worldview, a way of thinking, a collection of attitudes, dispositions, and motivations. Entrepreneurially minded individuals connect ideas and gain insights along their way. Of course, a mindset is also fundamentally based on connections in gray matter. Connected thinking, all thinking for that matter, is a neural phenomenon. Neuroscientist Dr. Narayanan Kasthuri of Argonne National Laboratory and the University of Chicago explores how the brain changes as it grows. "Just call me Bobby," he'll say. Bobby Kasthuri's lab is pioneering new techniques for large volume reconstructions of the fine structure of the nervous system, particularly complete and comprehensive maps of the brain, or connectomics. Prepare for this illuminating perspective. Please welcome to the stage, Bobby Kasthuri.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Bobby Kasthuri. As you saw in the introduction, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, and I think the very first neuroscientist hired at a national laboratory, at Argonne National Laboratory. And usually when I do this introduction, I say that means I am literally the best neuroscientist at Argonne National Laboratory. And very recently, my daughter pointed out to me that also means I'm the worst neuroscientist at Argonne National Labs. I'm hoping that you could use this talk to decide for yourself. And actually, before I get started, I really want to thank the Keynote Foundation, the Kern family, particularly Doug and Jordan and Michael for helping me set up and inviting me and having me here. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story of my own entrepreneurial mindset, of my own sort of journey to thinking about the brain. And actually, for me, it started in medical school. I went to medical school with the idea that I would help people, that there was an opportunity to contribute, there was an opportunity to make an impact. And I was particularly disappointed in the idea that for many illnesses, particularly illnesses of the brain, it was really the Wild West, and I suspect it's the same today, that we didn't have a fundamental understanding of how brains work. And without a fundamental understanding of how brains work, we couldn't really understand how brains didn't work or how they failed. And I suspect, like many entrepreneurs, I had this moment where I realized, oh man, I have to do this myself. And I have to figure out a way to understand the brain so that we can ultimately understand how we teach, diseases of the brain, et cetera. And as I started thinking about it, I realized that this isn't an easy task. And what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is tell you the scale of the task, what we expect to achieve from it, and why we would even think of something as crazy as this. And probably one way to kind of to frame it for you is to think about the great scientific achievements that we've done already. And probably in 100 years, in 150 years, 200 years, let's say, when we look back on the 20th century, we might say, what is probably one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century? And I would say, arguably perhaps, but maybe not, is that the greatest achievement of the 20th century was for us to understand the genetic basis of life. And it actually was sort of bookended by two specific maps. On the screen, you'll see on the left-hand side, one of the very first structures of the molecule of heredity, DNA. This is work done by Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin. And this map was at the map of an individual DNA molecule, how base pairs, adenine, thymine, et cetera, connect with each other. That map was then bookended probably 50 years later by the map of all base pairs in a particular human, called the human genome map. And I think this, in ways that people hadn't expected, fundamentally changed science, fundamentally changed biology, and probably will fundamentally change society. If this was the greatest achievement one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century, it's probably true that the 21st century, the great achievement, will be to map the physical basis of how we think, of our thoughts itself. And I suspect this, just like the revolution in genomics, will fundamentally change how we think about ourselves, how we teach students, and how we think about mental illnesses. So I wanted to take you through this idea But before I got too deep into it, I wanted to make sure that we were on the same page about what it is that brains are made of, what it is that we're trying to map. So in this next slide, I'll show you probably one of the very first pictures of a brain. This was a picture done by Santiago Ramon y Cajal in the very early 20th century. Cajal is probably considered maybe the Albert Einstein of neuroscience. And in every picture, he looks that sad. I don't know why. But what Cajal's big insight was to use the microscope. He was one of the first people to actually use a microscope to look inside a brain. And what he saw when he looked inside the brain, you could see in this little hand-drawing diagram on the right-hand side, was that he saw individual cells, here labeled A or C or G. And these cells were called neurons. And of course, I like to think that I'm as good as Cajal, but it's not clear. And he actually discovered three things in this particular picture. First is that neurons, unlike any other cell, most other cells in your body, are not symmetrical. They don't look the same when you look at them from the top or the bottom or the left or the right. And in fact, in this particular picture, let's say we take neuron A, you could see that there are at least three compartments to it. There's the soma, the cell body, that has the nucleus inside of it, I hope you could see. And there's a part that sticks out called the dendrite here in brown. And then there's another part that sticks out on the other end called the axon here in black. And what Cajal inferred, actually, truly genius, is that the way neurons communicate with each other, the way they make connections with each other, is that information flows up the axon, for example, up in F, into the dendrites of neuron A, and then out the axon of neuron A. And essentially, that's all there is to a brain. It's just neurons connecting with each other and passing information. You may have heard, perhaps, of artificial neural networks, artificial intelligence that uses neural networks. Well, this is the very first example of artificial neural network, here drawn instead of actually designed in a computer. And this is it. And the idea here is that this pattern of connections is literally everything about you. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to make sure. And to try to give you the power of connections and how they influence our thoughts, I thought I would tell you a little bit about a documentary that I read. It's about two twins, and they have a very specific sort of pathology. They're craniopagus, which means they're actually connected at the head. And in fact, these two particular twins, Krista and Tatiana Hogan, who were born October 25th, 2006 in Vancouver, if you took an MRI of their brain, you'd actually see that their brains are connected to each other. And most actually craniopagus twins, unfortunately, do not survive greater than 24 hours. But these two are actually now in high school, I think, and almost ready for college. There's an amazing documentary about them called Inseparable. But the part that I wanted to leave you with is that literally they have a kind of telepathy. Because their brains are connected to each other, you can actually close the eyes of one twin, show the other one a particular object, in this case in your lower left, let's say a little pink elephant, and the twin with the eyes closed can report on it. There is an actual kind of communication between the sisters that's not based on their particular physical senses. The same thing is true about where they're touched. So you could touch one twin on a particular part of the body, and the other twin can report it. And in fact, what this suggests to me is that it's just the connections, that it's really the connections that allow us to see things, to sense things, and perhaps even ultimately to think things. So I wanted to use this slide to tell you this is an important thing to try to map the connections. But you may ask, well, why hasn't this been done already? The Cajal picture was almost 120 years ago. And the reason it hasn't been done already is that in your brain, in all of your brains, we estimate that there's on order something like 100 billion neurons, 100 billion of those neurons that Cajal drew. Each of those neurons makes on order 1 to 10,000 connections with other neurons. So if you multiply all those numbers together, you get something like a quadrillion connections. A quadrillion connections in each of your particular brains. Now, a quadrillion is a hard number for me to think about. One way for you to think about it, I guess, is that it's about 100 to maybe 1,000 times more than stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So you walk around with about 100 to 1,000 galaxies worth of connections in your particular brain. And the hard part, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, is that fitting something that's a number of a quadrillion into a volume, let's say, of my skull, means that each particular connection is infinitesimally small. It's actually smaller than the wavelength of visible light. So there's never been an opportunity, until we hope very recently, to map all of them. So another way to say it is that if you could imagine that a single neuronal connection was the size of a large grain of sand, about a millimeter cubed, and you asked for all the connections in a particular brain, they would probably be more than multiple skyscrapers all put together. So that's our goal. The goal is to actually try to think about ways to map those particular connections. And I won't go too deep into the details. What we have done is realize that the only technique, the only way to image these connections is to use electron microscopy, and then we'd have to invent, in an entrepreneurial sense, a whole bunch of technologies associated with that. So for example, we take brains, as you can see in the top left, we stain them with heavy metals, osmium, uranium, things that are visible to the electron microscope. We embed them in plastic, and then we cut thousands and thousands of serial sections, one after the other of them, in this very Rube Goldberg-esque taping mechanism that we built. And ultimately, we image each one of those with each section with an electron microscope, and then we get computers and algorithms to analyze them and tell us what's in them. One version of telling you how hard and particularly complicated this is I'm going to show you what I did for my postdoctoral work, which took many years, where I tried to find every connection in an extremely small piece of brain, an extremely small piece of mouse brain, which I'm going to show you in the next slide. So here is a little piece of mouse brain that's probably much smaller than a grain of sand. And inside of it, we tried to map out how every connection works. So there's just, these cylinders are artificial. We just chose cylinders to limit ourselves. And actually, if you look inside this tiny, tiny, tiny piece of a mouse brain, what you'll find is that it's unbelievably complicated. There are thousands of axons, hundreds of dendrites, and tens of thousands of particular connections. And what's fascinating to me, what's been driving me, is that despite the fact that this looks like a huge tangled mess of spaghetti, it works again and again. Brains work again and again and again. And what are the fundamental rules by which these sets of connections are mapped, and how do they differ across mice and humans, et cetera, has been the goal. One thing, just to give you a scale, is that hairy mess that I showed you, which took me several years to trace out, actually is smaller than a single neuron that we saw in the Cajal diagram. And there's 100 billion of those in your particular brain. So one of the things we first realized is that this problem is probably one of the largest, biggest data set problems in fact, the history of humanity. For example, the human genome today would take about 200 gigabytes of data. The mouse connectome, not even the human connectome, would be orders and orders and orders of magnitude more data. In fact, if you took all the data, if you could imagine, let's say, that all the data that humanity has ever created or produced, let's say all of that data fits in the Library of Congress. Let's just take the Library of Congress as the one ultimate arbiter of all human data. That mouse connectome would probably be 100 to 1,000 times more data than all the data humans have ever collected in all of history. This sounds a little audacious, sounds a little crazy, frankly, and we realize that the only way that this is going to work is that you cannot do this in individual laboratories. What we need is a sort of national resource to build these. We need the largest supercomputers on the planet. We need the fastest electron microscopes, and perhaps other technologies like X-ray and et cetera. And this is a kind of a different vision, I suspect, perhaps an entrepreneurial vision, than how most science works. So I kind of laid out why the problem is so hard. And you may be asking yourself, you should be asking yourself, well then why do it? What's the point? And it turns out that at least for most neuroscientists, we believe that that map of connections is literally everything about you. Every thought, every memory, every skill, every hope, every fear, every dream is actually instantiated in that particular map of connections. And this, we think, is the big payoff. Can we find the physical basis of all these things that we associate with being a human, from dread to the entrepreneurial mindset, to a sense of humor? We believe all of these things should have a physical basis that's listed in the brain, and if you had the map of that particular brain, you would have the physical basis of all of these particular ideas. So that's one thing that we hope to achieve from the connectome. A separate thing, and this is, I think, becoming more and more obvious as we learn more and more about the brain, is that we think a lot of the pathologies that are associated with brains are actually miswires. Miswires in the sense that the inappropriate neurons are connected to each other, and that produces much of the mental pathologies that we see. For example, autism spectrum disorders, schizophrenia, for example, these are all thought to be miswired brains. And of course, we won't know what's the miswired until we know what the normal brain looks like. But we think that once we have the capability to see what a particular normal brain looks like, we can compare them. And I'm going to take 2 minutes to tell you one of my favorite stories, which is, and my children hate when I do this, which is that I think, and having 2 of them, and perhaps you have some as well, fascinating thing about children for me is that most of them have undiagnosed mental illnesses. And let me give you 2 examples of that. The first is when my daughter was about 5, she used to have an imaginary friend. And I don't know how many of you had imaginary friends. My mom tells me that I had imaginary friends as well. When she was young, I used to push her on this. I'd say, well, wait, what do you mean you have an imaginary friend? Can you hear them? Can you see them? Can you hear their voices? And she'd say, yeah, Dad, of course I can. If I told you that my postdoc had an imaginary friend whose voice that I heard, you'd say, well, Bobby, please, you should probably take him or her to see a doctor. But in children, this is perfectly acceptable. And it is almost as if this behavior in children is acceptable, but it becomes unacceptable when you become an adult. I'll tell you a story about my own mental illness when I was a child. This is back in the day where we used to have VHS tapes. I got my first VHS tape of Star Wars. And I watched it again and again and again and again. I watched it so many times, my mom tells me, that I broke the VHS, the tape broke. Again, if I told you that my colleague at the University of Chicago would watch the same thing again and again and again and again, you'd say, well, geez, that person should maybe they have obsessive compulsive disorder, and you should probably go and seek some help, right? But again, these are behaviors that are perfectly normal in our children, perfectly acceptable in our children, and there's this growing idea that some disorders are actually Peter Pan brains. These are brains that refuse to grow up. They keep their connections, they keep the same sort of network of connections that they had as a child, but they keep it into adulthood, where the behaviors are not considered appropriate. Again, we won't know until we were able to map a young brain and compare it to an old brain and see how many of the mental disorders that we characterize as adults are really just this kind of Peter Pan syndrome. A separate thing we'd really like to do is, can we give machines our mental powers? You may have heard that there are algorithms now, artificial intelligence algorithms, that could beat us in chess. They could beat us in Go. I actually recently read that there are AI algorithms that could beat us in poker, which is a little disturbing because that involves deception, right? And so you may get the sense that machines or algorithms are almost as good as we are. But they're actually not, Because none of those algorithms actually can walk to the chess table, can sit down at the chess table, see the chess pieces, and move it with the finesse and the ability that we have. So despite the fact that there have been substantial advances in artificial algorithms, there's so much lacking for that what they could do relative to what we can do. And I just want to give you one example. As you know, for my introduction, I spent a lot of time working at Argonne National Lab, which is one of these Department of Energy labs. And one of the things I keep telling them, and that they keep getting shocked by, is that the human brain, all of your brains, work on about 20 watts of power. If you think about it, many of the light bulbs in this room are maybe 60 watts, 80 watts. So many times, I suspect, you've thought of your friends or your colleagues or members of your family as kind of dim bulbs. And you're right, they are. But I think what's amazing is that that same 20 watts produces Shakespeare, produces Mozart, produces the general theory of relativity. And I know for a fact that the biggest supercomputers in the world, Argonne is about to build probably the fastest supercomputer in the world. The next generation, not the one they're building now, but the one after that, is going to require its own power source. It's going to require its own power plant. And there is no robot or algorithm or computer that does what we do at 20 watts of energy. So we think that there's a lot of opportunity here to, once we understand the brain, to explore other avenues. But again, none of this is exactly what I'm interested in. So I thought for the last 9 minutes of this particular talk, I'd tell you the things that I'm particularly interested in. And what I'm interested in is, how do human brains grow up? I suspect this is a thing we all share in common. Here in this particular picture, on the bottom row, I'm showing you probably faces that you're familiar with: Jane Goodall, Mahatma Gandhi, and Albert Einstein. What I took a little bit of digging, what most people don't know are their baby pictures, which you see on the top row above them. And of course, in some baby pictures, you can see the personality. Jane clearly loved animals from the very earliest ages. And the argument that I'd like to make is that when they were babies, they had no idea that they were going to be who they were. They had no concept of what it would take to be Albert Einstein or Mahatma Gandhi or Jane. And in fact, it's impossible to imagine that those skills, that those traits they had as adults was in their genome. There's just not enough information there. There's just not enough time to imagine that this is purely a genetic basis. So it must have been what they learned. And in fact, what's amazing about all three of them, amazing about my children as well, is that when they were born, they were totally useless. They were totally helpless. They didn't know any of the things that they needed to know to achieve what they did. And how did they acquire those things? By learning. By teaching, by interacting with other human beings. And in fact, it's probably true to say that if you were to define what is so amazing about a human relative to any other species, it is that we take forever to develop. We take decades to learn. And in fact, as is evidenced by me, you could be 40-something years old and still ask your parents for help, pay mortgages, et cetera. And there's this fundamental relationship that parents and children have among humans that's that's found really nowhere else in the particular animal kingdom. Now, this has obviously been known for decades. In fact, I found a poem that I thought by Alexander Pope called Nature of Man. And I'll just read it together. The beast and bird their common charge attend, the mothers nurse it, and the sires defend. The young dismissed to wander earth and air, there stops the instinct, and there ends the care. The link dissolves, each seeks a fresh embrace, another love succeeds, another race. A longer care man's helpless kind demands, that longer care contracts more lasting bands. And I would argue that it is this fundamental commitment that we have to the young of our particular species to teach them and educate them that actually makes the balance of society. That's actually literally what society is about, is teaching the next generation. And everything else is kind of noise around that particular signal. And why is that? Because we develop so particularly slow. Let me give you perhaps another example. This is from a book called Growing Young. And the book makes this argument that if, for example, if you look at our closest relative on the left-hand side, a chimpanzee, and you look at a juvenile chimpanzee versus an adult chimpanzee, really a young chimpanzee, it turns out that what we call the juvenile chimpanzee looks exactly like an adult. There's the juvenile version of me. And what I notice more and more in my life is the chimpanzification of me. where hair grows in places that you didn't expect it to grow, where our jaws get big, and et cetera. And really what it seems like is that we are temporally shifted relative to these other species. That what we call an adult is often considered a juvenile in other species, and what really is considered an adult for example, in the chimpanzee world is a really old human. And I think this idea of delayed development, this is the idea of ontogeny and phylogeny. Ontogeny is just a fancy way to say development, and phylogeny is a fancy way to say species. And this idea, actually in a book by Stephen Jay Gould that I read when I was in high school, I think, profoundly influenced me, which is that all differences in species, all differences in phylogeny, fundamentally come from differences in development. That if we understood the developmental process intimately, then we would know what the difference is between a chimpanzee and a particular human. So that's actually, for the last few minutes, the thing that I'm most interested in. How do we grow up? What is the nature of our connections as we grow up? And I'm going to just tell you one particular example. Usually when I teach this, I say, imagine you were a sculptor. In this particular case, this is the sculpture of David by Michelangelo, maybe one of the most famous sculptures in the world. And I want you to think, well, how many different ways are there to make a sculpture? And I want to say there are actually two particular ways to make a sculpture. The first way is that you can get, I think David's made of marble. I should check this before I give these talks. The first way is that you can get tiny, tiny little pieces of marble and glue them together. I'm going to call that the constructivist view of how to build brains. You keep adding connections. You keep adding and adding and adding and adding until you've gotten a sculpture. There's, of course, a second way to make a sculpture, which is actually the way sculptures are made, which is that you find a piece of marble that's bigger than David, that's actually bigger in dimensions than David, and you sculpt away everything that is not David in that piece of marble, revealing the David that was inside the entire time. And in fact, this is, we think, exactly how brains are formed. One way, of course, is that you might imagine when you're born, you have no connections between any neurons in your particular brain, and as you grow up, you make connections, just like the constructivist model. That's actually not how it works, we think. We think that when you're born, all neurons are connected to each other way more than they are as an adult. And in fact, what happens is that you sculpt the connections away, revealing the David inside of you, if I could say that. And why is this important? Why is this fundamentally an important idea? Well, usually when I teach this, I say, well, let's say you took this statue of David to my parents, who are Hindus, and they might say, well, that's great, but we really like our statue with 4 arms, not 2 arms. Then what do you do? Well, in the first world, where you're a constructivist, you just add more marble, and you make 2 more arms. But in the second world, where you sculpt, you're kind of out of luck. You may be able to add 2 more arms to this particular statue of David, but they will never be as strong. They will never look as contiguous as the original 2 arms. And so if it is actually true that our brains are much more like sculptures, where we remove things as we grow up, then there's to me, a fundamental issue, particularly with education, which is that once you make that David inside a student's mind, it's very hard to go back. And I'd like to imagine that as adults, we continue to learn and continue to sculpt our Davids, but we don't. And in fact, what happens is we are stuck with the Davids that we are brought up with. So it's not just that education is the key to society. It's actually potentially a one-way path. And I think that's the kind of insights that we as neuroscientists are trying to bring to this idea of how we teach and educate our kids. You guys have been paying very good attention, and I appreciate it. But there's got to be at least, I don't know, 10 of you that think, God, this guy is crazy. How are we going to collect the largest data sets in the world? How is any of this going to be possible? Well, it may or may not work. We'll see. I'm about to get tenure, so it probably doesn't matter. One way or the other. But I'd like to end a little bit with telling you why this particularly interests me. And I think really the only way to do it, again, is by analogy. And I think the key, perhaps, to educating people, to giving them an entrepreneurial mindset, et cetera, is to actually set as a goal the impossible idea, the impossible task. Let me just use one more slide to demonstrate this. I'm sorry that I missed the speaker yesterday, but I've been obsessed with going to space since I was very little. And I thought I would use, this is the quote that John F. Kennedy gives at Rice University in 1962, where he talks about going to the moon. And I'm just going to read it to you because it's amazing to me to imagine that this is how presidents used to talk. And Kennedy says at Rice, he says, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of us, measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that is a challenge that we are willing to accept, unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win." But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? They may as well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? I think he means in football. And a remarkable fact that I learned about this quote is that in 1969, when we land on the moon, the average age of a NASA scientist is about 29 years old. I don't know what the average age of a NASA scientist is now, but I think it's in the 50s or the 60s. So then if we play the tape back in 1962, many of those kids are in college, and they see this idea, this vision from Kennedy, and I think they decide to do space engineering, to do space science. And I think this is the thing that I feel like is a little bit lost in the last couple of decades. We don't set impossible goals anymore. We don't set ambitious goals anymore, not in a way that captivates our children. And I think this is the reason why I do this, not just because it's cool and we'll understand the brain, but I feel like setting these kinds of goals is what attracts students to what I do, is what attracts the next generation to what we do. And I think perhaps this should be utilized more. I have one last slide, and I added it at the very last minute because a separate thing that I think probably all of us share is in this entrepreneurial mindset is that there is a path. There are paths out to doing great things that don't have to come from standard academia. They don't have to come from the kind of research-focused world that we live in. And I just want to show you one last example, and I'll end with this. Again, it's about space. On the left-hand side is a guy named Robert Goddard, who really revolutionized rockets and et cetera. There he is standing, I think, next to one of the very first rockets he built, which I think went about 2 stories, and then dropped. And then he immediately started talking about going to Mars, if you could believe it. And what was shocking is that the entire academic community, including the New York Times, told him he was an idiot. And in fact, the New York Times wrote as an op-ed piece, "Professor Goddard does not know the relation between action and reaction, and the need to have something better than a vacuum against which to act. he seems to lack the basic knowledge ladled out daily in high schools, the New York Times op-ed piece. And when all of the people at the NIH, the NSF, they read this op-ed piece, he couldn't get any funding. He couldn't get anybody to support his particular research. And in fact, all of this research was funded by philanthropy and private institutions. And it was only after we landed on the moon, literally in 1969, where the New York Times offers a correction. As if us landing on the moon was finally enough evidence for the New York Times that you could operate a rocket in the vacuum of space. So I think I'd like to leave with this idea that there are many particular paths to achieving scientific greatness, if you will, and not all of them have to go through these standard models of how we think. And in fact, there's an entrepreneurial mindset there that we need to think about different ways to elevate and enhance people who are no longer particularly on the academic path. That's the last slide I have. I just wanted to tell all of you I've really enjoyed being at this conference. Unlike most neuroscience conferences, you're much friendlier than I'd imagined. And I want to thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to talking to you more. Thank you very much.